Thank you very much for that excellent introduction. I only caught the end, so I hope the first half of it was nice also. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here in Poland, and I'm honored to be able to be here and talk about our research here with you today. I'll start by giving a little bit of background about how we do this research and what its value is. I know some of you may be familiar with the report. This year's report is a little bit different, but it's based on the same data collection, the same kind of data set. What the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, or DBIR, it's based on investigations of incidents. So it's that makes it different from some other sorts of research. Some are based on surveys, some are based on like a company's view on malware. This is based on investigations of incidents. And these are all of the 50 contributors who contributed data to the research. So it's not just Verizon Security Services, it's all of these different contributors or partners. I'd also like to take a second at the bottom there to highlight one in particular. Thank you to CERT Poland for being a contributor. There are probably others from Central and Eastern Europe up there as well. We're really happy each year we do this when the number of participants goes way up because it's a larger sample of the universe of what's going on in cybercrime and information security. Obviously, we can never be sure that we're getting a representative sample of the universe of all of the information security incidents, but we're more and more confident as we go on that we have a good sample. We have many countries represented. We have different kinds of organizations like CERTs, security companies, law enforcement agencies. So we think we have a pretty good view, a pretty good sample of what's going on to form a foundation for this research. Just a little bit more about our methodology. What we do with all of the thousands of incidents we get from those organizations is we code them so that we can put them in a structured format, structured data, and then run statistics on them. And these are the four things that we describe. So when a participant, a partner, gives us like a case report or something like that, we read it and we code it for these data points. We describe the actor who did it, we describe the action they did, and we describe the asset they affected, like a server, what was it running, and we describe the attribute that was affected, like the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of that asset. And we have many different smaller attributes, but these are the four basic kinds of things that we describe. This is what our research collects data on to describe who's doing what to whom. And by the way, this is an openly available framework for describing security incidents. You can read about it at that URL. It has detailed definitions of all of the terms that I'm going to use, and you can also use it as a reference implementation. Many other organizations use it to describe their own incidents so that they can study them and so they can compare information about their own incidents with this research. So like I said, this year we took a little bit of a different approach. Before we described sort of the whole universe at one time. We said across the world we saw these things be more common. Across the world these things were less common last year. But this year we realized that we could divide all of the incidents we saw into very specific patterns and then make specific recommendations based on those. When we looked at the data, we realized there are a long list of things that people could do. We have all of our hacking actions, we enumerated them, and we have all of our actors, the different kinds of hacktivists and state affiliated. But it would not be true to say that anybody could be doing any action against any victim. What we actually saw were a smaller number of specific patterns that really described the vast majority of what was really going on. This started last year when, towards the end of when we were writing our report, we realized these three big patterns really dominated our data. They described almost about 2/3 of what we saw. The first one was point of sale systems, the skimmers, ways to get in there, actually the malware to go in and get the card track data like we were talking about. The second one up there is the skimming, the ATM, the cash machine skimming, to get the card data. And then the third one, we jokingly referred to it as assured penetration technique. That's what people call APT. We joked like that because APT is such a difficult term that means different things to different people in different conferences. But we realized that just those three big patterns, by the numbers, those accounted for 2/3 of what we saw. So we asked the question, are there other patterns that also cover the majority of the data? Are there other medium-sized patterns that we could find? And could we look for them in a rigorous way? And the answer is yes. So what we did is we used the structured Veris encoding, the way we code each incident, for statistical clustering to find these new patterns of incidents that are very similar to each other. So what you see here, that's too small to read, is the full encoding of an incident. Remember I said there are 4 main things, and we describe many attributes under each of those 4 things. This is what one full incident looks like after we encode it. And so, for example, that's the asset variety. Maybe it's a server. There's the malware vector. Maybe it was a drive-by installation. So what we did is you can almost think of this as like the DNA of one security incident. And we actually took a page out of the book of biology, and in the same way that you can compare 2 animals and say how closely is their DNA related, we compared each of our incidents, each of our many thousands of incidents. So for example, in biology, you might say these 2 things are very closely related, they're the same species. You might say these things are sort of closely related, maybe they're the same genus, they're close, but not the same species. We did the same sort of thing, the clustering, with all of the tens of thousands of security incidents that we had over the years. And basically what we did a multidimensional scaled plot. Sorry to the translator, I don't know the Polish term for multidimensional scaled plot. But it looks like this. So what this does is it visualizes all of the incidents that we've studied over the last 10 years. And it's got 9 patterns here that describe 92%. So more than 9 out of 10 incidents can be described by one of these clusters here. And what this does is we have the computer that runs for a while, and it compares every single one of our thousands of incidents. And if they're very close, it moves them close together. If they're very different from each other, it pushes them further apart. So we did this first, and just by the data, these are the clusters that we saw. And then within each cluster, we looked at it and said, well, what are the attributes that all of these incidents have in common? And we gave them names. So these are the names that we recognize as humans. So you can see at the top right, we have what we call cyber espionage. We said all of those incidents that cluster together, they're similar with many attributes in common. This is what we think of as cyber espionage or APT, that sort of thing. All those incidents at the bottom left, those all look like point-of-sale intrusions, where malware goes into the point-of-sale terminal and gets the credit card data and then goes back to make money. They have similar attackers, similar vectors of infection, things like that. And it's interesting to start to see which things are more and less similar. So for example, you can see cyber espionage and point-of-sale are pushed very far apart. They have very few things in common. But within cyber espionage, you can see there are almost 2 different clusters. There's 2 sub-clusters of cyber espionage. And I can just sort of give you the punchline now. What that is there are 2 groups around the initial attack vector. The larger cluster is through spear phishing emails, and then the smaller cluster is through strategic web compromise or web drive-bys. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But it's interesting, even though those are very similar with cyber espionage, they still have some distinctions between those patterns. So these are the patterns we identified. And what that lets us do is that lets us describe each one in much more detail and then make very concrete recommendations to help. So this is sort of the central slide of the research. We have all of those 9 attack patterns that you can see listed across the top. And then also, for every incident we get, we note the victim industry. So we realized for each victim industry, we can just say, of all of the incidents we saw in this industry, what percentage were in each attack pattern? So this is helpful for where are we now, what might you need to pay attention to. And this is important because even as recently as a few years ago, if someone said, what do I need to be worried about in information security, we almost had to give an answer, well, this is the big thing this year, this is what's most common this year, but it might not have been important for that person's industry. For example, the first row, the top row, is accommodation industry, like hotels. If someone does information security for a large chain of hotels and they ask me what's important, China's not important. China is probably not doing much against, the Holiday Inn. I'm sorry, that's a common American hotel. I know there's at least one here, I've seen it. But I can tell them that about 75% of what we saw last year, over the last few years, was point of sale intrusions. So that's really where they should be focusing their resources. And if a security vendor tries to tell them, I'm going to sell you this product that protects you against cyber espionage, I can say in the last few years, from all 50 of these partners, I haven't seen a single incident of cyber espionage against a hotel. Now, that's not to say it's impossible, but if you have to spend your money and resources one place or another, this helps you focus. So this is sort of the chart that I keep on my wall at home. It helps me remember where I am in the research. And this is sort of what I would recommend to you guys here today is take a look at, figure out which industry you work in or which industry you're protecting, and then look across and see which patterns are most likely to occur in your industry. And then those are the ones to pay attention to. Maybe go back and read the report, read the sections about those patterns. I'd also like to take a minute at this point to look at the Central and Eastern European perspective. And so it's not perfect, it's only a smaller section of our sample. But first I looked at the victims, and we saw that victims in the Central and Eastern European region, the first thing up there that you see on the left is all kinds of security incidents. That largest number is everything else, and when we looked into that, what that actually is those are incidents that we didn't have enough detail to put into a classification. So unfortunately, we got a lot of incidents from Central and Eastern Europe that involved phishing, but we didn't know anything else about them, so we weren't able to categorize them. So really the takeaway there is that it would be valuable to collect more detail about some of these security incidents. It's also interesting to see there's a fair amount of cyber espionage, a lot of crimeware, and then also if you look at not just security incidents where we had over 1,000 sample size, but just data breaches where something private became public. We had 159 sample size. We also see a fair amount of point of sale. So that's interesting to me. Back in the United States, some people might say, oh, cyber espionage is something that China and the US are doing against each other, but not other people. There are plenty of other countries affected. Same thing with point of sale. There's this idea in the United States, we only have the magnetic stripe. We don't have chip and pin on our cards yet. So there's this idea that, in Europe, you have chip and pin, so you're safe. So point of sale attacks don't happen anymore. No one's credit card numbers get stolen. Apparently that's not the case. That still happens too. So there are other patterns that we didn't have much of a sample of. I don't think that means that it doesn't happen here. I think that just means the few partners that we got don't happen to study those kinds of incidents. So I still think that that first chart, that still applies to the organization based on industry type. The other look I took at Central and Eastern European data was the threat actors. What kinds of actors, malicious actors, do we see coming from Central and Eastern Europe? And that's also interesting. So a fair number of cyber espionage actors, a lot of crimeware actors, a little bit of web application, that's like SQL injection, those kinds of attacks, and a whole lot of point of sale. So whenever we, in other parts of the world, investigate point of sale intrusions, a lot of those eventually come back to criminals operating in Central and Eastern Europe. So what I'd like to do now is just talk through a few of those incident patterns to just show you when we focus in on them, here's what we can describe and what we can recommend about them. So the first one is point-of-sale intrusions. These are remote attacks against environments with retail transactions. So think, they get the malware on the system and then someone pays with their card and then that card data goes to the attacker. Large number of attacks. Like Miko was saying before, we've been seeing this for a while, but they're still very frequent. The interesting thing to us is that the number of these attacks is actually declining. You can see over the years, it's roughly been going down a little bit. That other trend line there is for web application attacks. We don't know for sure that they're inversely correlated, but it certainly seems that way. So it would be interesting to hypothesize if the same threat actors are shifting from one sort of attack to another for some reason. Brute forcing access, either guessing a password or finding unprotected systems, is still the primary access to point-of-sale systems. And again, like Miko mentioned in the last presentation, we've seen a shift to RAM scraping, where the malware takes the card data out of memory rather than keystroke logging. A few years ago, the malware basically read the numbers as they went, like as if they were keystrokes. Now the malware is basically grabbing the information from memory, so perhaps that's more efficient for them. And the recommended controls almost look a little bit simple, but our research suggests that these are basic steps that are not being taken. There are huge numbers of organizations that are not doing the basics right, and those are the ones that are falling victim to this. Organizations leaving open remote access, using the same system for processing card transactions, and also surfing the internet when there's no customers. Poor password policies, they don't have antivirus, so a lot of these basic things. And then the last two recommendations for a large organization, those are other recommendations that might help break the chain of events that we see in this pattern. Web app attacks are the cluster of incidents where a web application was the attack vector. So think of things like SQL injection and other failure to validate credentials, things like that. So there are two common motivations for this: the ideology or fun, like the hacktivism, or the financial motivation, breaking in to steal money. And there's sort of two little subclusters again in this incident pattern. Discovery is very bad. It takes people a long time to discover that this has happened, so there's room for improvement there. And most of the ways that attackers get in are through weak input validation, like with SQL injection, or stolen credentials. So we also see a lot of people somehow able to get compromised credentials like username and password and then go through the web application that way. And it's interesting to see what people use the systems for once they've gotten into an application. And again, that breaks down onto the two sides. On the ideology and fun side, the hacktivists, they typically use, they often compromise content management systems or CMSs for distributed denial of service attacks, or to do other kinds of things to make their point or get attention. On the financially motivated side, of course, they go straight through the web application to the database that has information they can make money from. So credit card numbers, user accounts, user information, personal information, those sorts of things. And of course, the recommended controls are things that would break this link of events again. So two-factor authentication would go a very long way. Many of these attacks would be stopped if someone also had a token of some kind in addition to their username and password. Content management systems we said rethink CMS, rethink content management systems, because there were so many of these attacks where when we went back and looked, we thought maybe there wasn't even a good reason to have a content management system. It could have just been static content on a server. What's happening over and over again is people are setting up a content management system for a very simple problem, but then they forget about it, so they don't patch it, they don't protect it. So a large number of these are getting compromised. So either get rid of it if you don't actually need it, or actually plan for patching and to maintain the security of a content management system. it seems almost silly to have to recommend validating inputs in 2014, but many people, many organizations, many web applications are still not doing that. And then again, some basic things that would detect these things, or, well, enforcing lockout policies would actually prevent these, and then monitoring outbound connections would detect a lot of these things. Many of these attacks, as soon as they happen, there's lots of outbound traffic that would tip an organization off, that would warn them that something is going wrong. But many organizations aren't monitoring for that. The first time they know that they've been compromised is when their country's CERT calls them and says, you're conducting a distributed denial of a service attack or some kind of denial of a service attack. Did you know that you're compromised? And then they go back and find out. So if they had been monitoring outbound communication, they would have known that. The next pattern is insider and privilege misuse. So this is what many researchers call the insider threat, the person on the inside of your organization. And the strict definition we used is unapproved or malicious use of organizational resources. This is by an internal actor. But there are actually, I should make the point, there are some external actors that we see here as well because of people working together, like someone outside bribes someone on the inside. The first thing that was most interesting to us here is that most activity abuses trust necessary to perform normal duties. So you can see when we graphed all of the actions that we see in this pattern, by far the biggest one is the one we call privilege misuse. That's an internal actor who already had the permission to do those things that they were doing, to access the data that they accessed. And I think this is useful because it's a contrast to a popular conception. A lot of time when I hear people talk about the insider threat, they're looking for someone who exceeds their authorized access, someone who sort of hacks access to some more sensitive data and then steals it. But this says that's not the case. This says people already have access to the data that they're stealing. So we might need to look for different sorts of things to catch this sort of activity. By the way, I'll just make a quick point about our charts. You might have noticed many of our numbers add up to more than 100%. That's because the categories are not mutually exclusive. So for example, if someone abused privilege access and then also used an unapproved USB device to take the data out of the organization, we would check both of those boxes. Both of those charts would go up. So we would say in 88% we saw privilege abuse, and then in an additional 18% we saw unapproved hardware like a USB device. So that's why the numbers add up to more than 100%. I forgot to mention that at one presentation, and someone told me Verizon must think that information security is really bad. There are so many attacks, they all add up to more than 100%. But that's not the case. They're not mutually exclusive categories. The second takeaway I want to highlight about this is that most incidents happen at the victim organization, like within the four walls of the victim. So again, there's a misconception that if you let people work remotely, those are the kinds of people who have the opportunity to steal data. And that does happen sometimes, but it was really interesting to us that it's inside trusted actors using access they're supposed to have while they're sitting inside the building at work, where a lot of the vast majority of the data gets stolen. So it's interesting that we have to look for more subtle indications. Speaking of things to look for, internal detection is actually unusually fast and common for this pattern. So what we find is that things like audits are very effective. Both IT audits for, what is this user account doing? Does this user account still need this privilege? And financial audits. Both of those are actually very effective at detecting the insider threat. And so that's sort of our first recommendations are to know who has access to the data, remove access when they don't need it, review the user accounts, watching for data going out, and then also publishing results of audits so that people know these things are being audited very frequently. You would get caught if you tried to do it, so to try to deter activity. The next pattern is physical theft and loss, which is interesting. Some people ask, why is this in the report? It does affect IT assets. So even though it's less exciting than, say, web application attacks, it accounts for a huge number of data breaches. So we thought that it was worth, contrasting with the other patterns. Again, the problem is most prevalent within a victim organization, within the four walls, instead of outside. Most of these assets are stolen from offices, more than vehicles or homes, things like that. So again, it's as if you need to be more secure within your own building. You can see the relative percentages on the right. We also thought it was really interesting that loss was reported 15 times more often than theft. We're not sure what's going on there, so that's sort of an area of future research. We want to figure out why those numbers are so different. It's also interesting that most losses and thefts are reported because the victim had to, there was a regulation or law, more than they were disclosed because there was fraud that resulted from the loss. And just by the numbers, the data that's most often lost is personal information and medical data, and that's probably a skew in the sample because those kinds of industries have the strongest regulations where they have to disclose a data breach or when something gets lost. The recommendations, again, are a little bit simple. It almost seems sad to have to say in 2014, encrypt the data, encrypt portable devices, and yet many organizations aren't doing that, or they aren't checking. They think they encrypted something, but they didn't actually, they didn't have a way to test that or to demonstrate that that had been encrypted. And then some basics, keeping the device with you, have backup so that when something gets lost, it reduces the impact on your business. Miscellaneous errors is the second sort of less sexy pattern that still causes a lot of incidents, so it's worth talking about. We found that highly repetitive processes with sensitive data are particularly error-prone. The two top things there are misdelivery and publishing error. Misdelivery is where there's some sort of technical process, like there's a machine that puts everyone's medical statement in an envelope and then sort of sends it out and puts them in the mail, but the machine has a hiccup, and then each medical statement goes in the next person's envelope. So each one of us gets the next person's medical statement, and then they all go out in the mail, and then everyone opens the envelope with their name and they see the statement with the next person's name. So that sort of thing actually happens fairly often. The second one, the publishing error, is back in the IT realm. It's like on websites. These are situations that you hear about where someone was storing sensitive data on the same server as the web server, and then they accidentally made that directory viewable. So someone, just guessing addresses on the website said, hey, did you know that this document was publicly available? Did you know you had all these files in a directory and I can see it on your website? Those happen fairly frequently as well. So discovery is also very slow for these. So it would be worth looking for these and trying to monitor these processes better to catch them before they happen. So data loss prevention software is one technical solution that might help. But really, this is a people and processes problem. The processes around posting documents could be tighter, and things like large mailings should be spot checked. Someone should actually just check one envelope and one statement to make sure they match. And then there's also a disposal problem. Disposal error is the third most common one, where a laptop with sensitive data just gets thrown out or sold on the internet with an auction. And people thought that the IT department carefully wiped everything before it got disposed, but maybe the person didn't know about it. We find in a lot of places, they think they have a policy that when you're done with the laptop, you have to give it to IT, who wipes it and then disposes of it, but those policies aren't actually enforced all the time. Crimeware is sort of an interesting pattern. It's any malware incident that did not fit other patterns. And actually what you can think of this as, it has a sort of reverse survivorship bias. This is all the malware that did not get blocked by antivirus. So it's sort of interesting to take a look at what got through that wasn't from China and wasn't specifically, you know, that financially motivated cybercrime. And I think the biggest takeaway is that the initial vectors are web downloads and drive-bys. So by far, those are the ways that the rest of this malware, the malware that successfully infects systems, is getting onto computers. So this sort of gives us an idea of where we might want to detect or prevent malware from coming into the organization. And again, the goals, like we talked about, the goals are to gain control of systems for illicit uses. They might still steal the credentials, they might use the machines in other attacks, sending out spam, or just monetizing them in other ways like we talked about before. And then those are the basic sorts of, well, basic and then slightly more advanced measures that would help protect an organization against these. The last one, I think I called this point of sale earlier. I'm sorry, the point of sale was the malware one. These are the payment card skimmers, where it's an actual physical device that copies the data off of a card. So most of the actors are Eastern European, but most of the assets are ATMs, the cash machines. And you can see that it's interesting. We can see the chart of where the different actors are from when we, finally eventually trace them back, and then they're really basic recommendations for how to prevent and detect this. But it's still fairly common. Cyber espionage is the pattern. The way we define this is unauthorized network or system access linked to state-affiliated actors or exhibiting the motive of espionage. We said state-affiliated because in practical terms, the people who work directly for a government or who work for the benefit of that government actually look very similar. So there are a few other research organizations out there that do a really good job of researching into the details to say this is the guy and this is exactly who he works for. But we realized for this research, it's actually more helpful to look at this as one group of what's going on. An interesting change from last year is who's doing this. So until fairly recently, almost all of the actors actually seemed to be either working for or directly for the benefit of a government, a national government. What's interesting is that we're starting to see more organized crime, like clearly identifiable organized crime actors working in this attack pattern as well. And of course, the real number might be 20% instead of 11%, but it's interesting that that's starting to become more common, or at least more visible. Another perspective on this is the actions. One way of talking about cyber espionage is to say, look at how capable these people are. I mean, sure, they only work as hard as they have to, but here are the many complex actions that they can do. Here are the ways they get in. Here are all the things they do to move laterally within an organization, persistence with rootkits, all of these cool and very, very complicated things that they can do. But in contrast to that is the second chart up here, the initial attack vector. What we thought was interesting is, as much as they do and as complicated as they can get once they're inside, there are two main ways that they get in, either through an email attachment, like the spear phishing email, or through a web drive-by. And also, that's another contrast over the last year or two. A couple of years ago, it was much more predominantly just spear phishing, and then over the years we've seen spear phishing, stay at least as popular, but web drive-bys have become more popular. And web drive-by is just another name for like the strategic web compromise, where they compromise a website because they know a target will visit that website, and then they compromise the target through a download from the website. So that's an interesting perspective. If you're looking for a place to stop this chain, we think the initial vector is a good place to monitor and try to stop the event chain. So the next bullet point there is that discovery methods leave a lot of room for improvement, and they're very poor. Most organizations are not detecting this themselves. They find out that they have the problem when the government calls them and says, did you know you have this problem? Or more often now, a security researcher calls them and says, I've been monitoring this nation's infrastructure, and you should know that you have a problem. So the recommended controls start with the basics, because you really need to do the basics well before you'll be able to see this sort of state-affiliated activity. And then there are other more advanced ones. We would recommend good logging, because a lot of organizations, after they find out that this happened, they don't have good enough logs to try to figure out, well, what did they access? Well, where else have they been? So improved logging would help with gauging the impact. We recommend, so that bullet point is very short. It says, break the delivery, exploitation, installation chain. That's a short way of saying, go read about the kill chain, read Lockheed Martin's paper about kill chain analysis, the idea of a chain of events, they all must happen, but you can break the chain anywhere, you can study the chain, so read about that. It's valuable to think in those terms. And then watching C2 is command and control infrastructure. Watch for that sort of network traffic to detect this, and then also watching for lateral movement inside of a network. So those are a few of our basic patterns. And the next sort of question is, so what? So I think that we've made a little bit of an improvement over previous years of research. We said once we describe a pattern, we can start to say which specific controls or protections would have helped you detect it, which controls would have helped you prevent this attack from happening. But one of the requests we get about our research is we say, well, okay, you studied this, but can you give us more practical advice? Help us, decide what to do, or what does your research suggest what we ought to do? So this year, what we did is we talked to our partners at SANS, who produced the SANS Critical Security Controls list, the SANS Top 20. And we did a mapping of our incident patterns to the SANS Top 20 controls. And we said, sure, all of the SANS Top 20 are good. We won't argue with that. But for each specific pattern, which of the top 20 controls would have especially or specifically helped detect or prevent this pattern? So you can sort of combine this with the first chart and say, in my industry, I'm most likely to see this sort of pattern. Which specific controls do Verizon and SANS think would be best able to help me detect or prevent this pattern? So this is sort of to help guide conversations. So when you're talking with a security person and a manager, or security and the business people saying, what should we spend our money on? Where should we put our resources? This can help guide that discussion. And the last thing we did, remember, so I thought, well, when we have that first chart where we say, if you know your victim industry, you can see which patterns you're likely to face, literally by the numbers, the percentages. And then here in this chart, we said for each pattern, we thought about which controls are best. So I thought, well, we can sort of put those things together and sort of just do some math for you and say, if you have confidence in our numbers of attack pattern frequency in each industry, and you have confidence in our mapping of the patterns to controls, then you can sort of multiply across and say, you have to rotate this in your head, you can say, for my industry, if I believe the numbers of how likely I am to face each pattern and which controls best match each pattern, this is a rough heat map of which controls you might want to prioritize. There's a longer explanation of that in the report, but that's basically what we tried to do. So in my mind, that first chart with the industries and patterns, and then these ones here, they sort of say what's happening to each industry and what are the most likely, what are probably the best ways to start addressing that. So I think I have about 1 minute left. I'll just leave this up for the 1 minute of one question probably. This is where you can get more information. The email address goes to my whole team, so hopefully someone smarter than me will answer your question if you email dbir@verizon.com. And the last thing I want to highlight is that last bullet point. The data we do here, we have to keep private because of our agreements with those partners, but we also have a public community project at that last address where we take publicly disclosed data breaches and code those in the same way, so you can run your own numbers on them. And actually, I'm afraid I might have used my last minute. Do we have time for one question, or should I stop?
Yes, we have time for one question. Proszę Państwa, mamy czas na jedno pytanie.
Yes, we do have a time for one question at this point, and may I invite you to ask it?
Can you comment one control that you have suggested that was to publish the audit reports? What do you mean by that?
Because audits are so effective at detecting insider threats, we believe that there's evidence that if a company management says, we will audit this, so don't do anything bad because we'll catch you on Friday. If the management says every Friday we check all of the accounts, every Friday we check all of the financial accounts to make sure no money is missing, we think there's some evidence that that would deter an employee from stealing the money or from accessing something and copying the data because they know that they would be caught on Friday when the audit happens. Does that make sense? No? Okay.
Steven, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.